Hello, my name is Richard Ward and I'm a PhD student from Michigan Technological University. Today I'm going to be co-presenting with Dr. Stefka Rostovin. We'd like to thank you all for coming out, and we'd especially like to thank Donna Goldstein and Kristen Drybread, not only for the opportunity to publish on a subject for which we're so impassioned, but also for their extensive efforts along with Alice Phillips in editing our work to help make it possible. Presidential campaign slogans operate as shorthand phrases that succinctly convey a worldview to a select set of audiences. In his 2016 and 2020 campaigns, Donald J. Trump aroused visions of the American dream and who might have access to it by using three slogans to summon this idea of a deserving yet overlooked white underclass that had been left behind by an unfairly rewarded and privileged minority that was morally corrupt. These slogans were "Make America Great Again," "America First," and "Keep America Great." They are directly tied to the racist discourses historically associated with the Ku Klux Klan in the United States and the Nazi movements of the 1930s and 40s in Germany. While the Trump campaign initially concealed as a public secret the alignment of these three slogans with a history of white supremacy, by 2020 the slogans had become outright propaganda for white supremacy. In this essay, we explore the historical connections between these phrases and white supremacist movements, revealing the racist ideologies behind Trump's vision of a great America. We argue that by demonizing minority groups as backward and morally corrupt, Trump was able to displace his own political corruption onto the other. American literature scholar Sarah Churchwell has dedicated an entire book to examining the history of the phrase "America First" in political discourse. According to Churchwell, the phrase is attuned to an ideal future and rooted in an ideology of belonging and exclusion. It has informed the space of the political in the United States for more than 100 years and indeed found renewed manifestation in the Trump campaigns. Building on Churchwell's work, in this essay we draw on semiotics, the study of signs, to show that the phrase "America First" is a sign that has historically been anchored in a secretive discourse associated with the ideology of white supremacy. The shared secret is that the mainstream conservative framework Trump aligns himself with harbors white supremacist ideologies and supports racist social frameworks. Conservatives claim that their intentions were to provide genuine economic opportunities for hard-working Americans in an economy that has displaced many low-wage jobs to overseas manufacturing. Donald Trump promised that his administration was going to get those jobs coming back. This idea of shifting focus onto hard work and an individual responsibility glosses over extremely important racial and classist features in much the same ways as racist conservative policies were masked in World War II. Political white supremacy is often exploited purposefully. This was apparent in the case of the Republican politicians who deployed the Southern strategy to curb the dismantling of Jim Crow laws in the 1950s and 60s. Targeting white voters who had once considered themselves Democrats but felt suddenly powerless in the face of an emerging politics that demanded racial equity. The Southern strategy was embraced by the Goldwater presidential campaign in 1964 and redefined the Republican Party as a whole by establishing a direct link between political conservatism and white supremacy. At the beginning of Trump's 2016 campaign, this link between political conservatism and white supremacy is still held, but it had become a public political secret among Republican Party insiders. A political secret, according to the German-American political theorist Carl Friedrich, is the process of secreting information about political entities, especially when that information has significant implications for rival entities of the general public. First and foremost, candidate Trump was able to exploit the secrecy surrounding the link between political conservatism and white supremacy in the country to deny the presence of contemporary racism and bigotry in his campaign. Second, Trump used the secrecy as a barrier that separated his campaign from the fascist and Confederate ideologies it rehashed. To understand this argument more fully, it's important to explore ideas of semiotics and myths, as they can help to illuminate the far right and Confederate ideology secreted within Trump's campaign slogans. The Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure One of the thinkers who shaped the field of modern semiotics defined semiotics as the study of signs and sign-using behavior. Saussure insisted that signs could be anything used to convey meaning, and he argued that each sign contains two parts, a signifier and a signified. The signifier is what conveys meaning. It can be anything. It can be an image, a word, a gesture. The signified is the meaning a given signifier evokes. Semiotics not only allows us to ask about the cultural ideologies that shape meaning, but also encourages us to take account of the historical and cultural landscapes in which signs circulate. Using semiotics to study the slogan America First and the sentiments it has signified in different historical periods from the early 1900s to the present, such as anti-German, anti-Italian, anti-black, anti-Mexican, and so on, we are able to trace the path by which 21st century conservative political discourse has become capable of maintaining a post-racial posture, also secretly aligning itself with racist right-wing ideologies. In semiotics, the link between signs and ideologies is often addressed through analysis of the myths or mythologies connoted by signs. Roland Barthes famously described myth as a system of communication defined by social or cultural meanings of the world in relation to the people in it, specifically within a historical context. According to Barthes, everything holds within it the possibility of myth because every sign construction carries a multiplicity of meanings. Some of the meanings of a given sign appear to be natural or common sense because they're deeply embedded in cultural ideologies that have been perpetuated by these institutions that surround us, institutions like our families, churches, and schools. Because we tend to accept as givens the meanings these institutions impose on the world, one might say we are a reflection of these very same institutions that created our social and political consciousness. In return, we nurture and reinforce their structures. Because semiotics fundamentally rejects the notion that any given word or sign has a singular meaning or a singular signification, it's a particularly relevant method for analyzing the meaning of signs within the context of secrecy. Semiotic analysis reveals how multiple meanings can coexist and how signs can be read differently based on the cultural and historical knowledge one brings to the analysis. Semiotics is also relevant to the study of secrecy because it elevates the importance and centrality of shared meaning and thus raises the question, who is in on the secret? The task of the semiotician, therefore, is to excavate and illuminate the multiplicity of meanings a sign can convey and to explore the ideologies behind these meanings, even when the sign is a phrase that claims to be ahistorical, post-racial, and yes, even innocently singular. According to Churchwell, we can distinguish between several historical periods in which politicians harnessed the phrase America First to identify whom they considered a true American. The phrase's political origins are telling. President Woodrow Wilson prominently introduced it into politics in 1915 speech, Making America First, an expression of isolationism and anti-British sentiment during World War I. Next, using the war as a pretext, American media magnates such as William Randolph Hearst and politicians such as the statesman and jurist Charles Evan Hughes harnessed the phrase to express existing domestic anti-immigrant and anti-black sentiments. As America First became a hallmark of early 20th century xenophobic discourse against so-called hyphenates such as German Americans, Italian Americans, and Irish Americans, it took on a hint of menace. During the same period, the phrase was also deployed in overtly racist discourses that discriminated against African Americans because they too were seen as somehow less than the model white American, given the infamous one-drop rule that made a person legally black in the United States if they had a single black ancestor. Thus, in the early 20th century, America First was shorthand for keeping America for pure Americans. In the 1920s, the socially and politically acceptable xenophobia expressed by America First made it an apt slogan for the KKK to use both in promoting the lynching and killing of African Americans, and when advocating for the policies that marginalized immigrants. Texas Klan leader's 1919 speech perfectly demonstrates how this additional layer of meaning was added. In relation to racial purity, he declared, "I am for America, first, last, and all the time, and I don't want any foreign element telling us what to do." During Jim Crow, the secondary meaning of the term operated in secret among supporters of the KKK. As Churchwell writes, for the Klan, America First operated as a fig leaf, enabling a xenophobia that was socially and politically acceptable to cover over a vigilante racism that was, at least officially, not. In other words, the phrase allowed KKK members to protest that they were simply advocating for the purge of alien elements from the United States and that they had nothing against black people. A number of media outlets and civic organizations have recently provided visual evidence of this historic association of the KKK with the slogan America First. The image of a man carrying an America First banner at a KKK parade in Binghamton, New York in 1900 has circulated widely across History.com, National Public Radio, and other news organizations that have recently published articles detailing the history of the KKK. Another piece of evidence that has recently appeared in the media is a 1921 circular that listed the ABCs of the KKK: America First, benevolence, clannishness. It was featured in The Nation in an article by the historian Kevin Cruz that charts the long genealogy of the phrase America First. These images are important because they provide historical evidence linking the slogan to the KKK in the first decades of the 20th century. By the 1930s, America First began to be claimed by extremist far-right groups, some of which styled themselves fascist, like the German-American Bund and the Klan. As these groups adopted the slogan and increased its circulation in public discourse, they further entrenched it in racist ideologies. As these two ideologies converged in the decade before World War II, America First came to represent both the Ku Klux Klan and fascism in the United States. By the 1940s, fascism in this country found political expression through the America First Committee, which sprang up to protest U.S. intervention in the war. The AFC boasted notably anti-Semitic superstars such as automaker Henry Ford and sports administrator Avery Brundage, both of whom were among its leadership. Instead of agitating for war, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it in every possible way, for they will be among the first to feel its consequences, said AFC spokesman Charles Lindbergh. Not long after Lindbergh uttered these words in a speech in Des Moines, Iowa on September 11, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, prompting the United States to officially enter the war. The AFC dissolved very shortly thereafter, but America First has continued to subtly infuse far-right conservatism ever since. The influence of the slogan was strikingly evident in the 2000 presidential campaign of Pat Buchanan, who took up the mantra America First and was even quoted as saying that World War II was an unnecessary war, a pretty fairly unpopular stance considering the atrocities commonly understood to have prompted the United States to enter in the first place. Another presidential hopeful at that time was none other than Donald J. Trump, and he was seeking the Reform Party nomination in competition with Buchanan. During that campaign, Trump drew attention to Buchanan's slogan and his opinions on World War II by calling him a Hitler lover. This quote is evidence that Trump has long known precisely what America First means and is well aware of the cultural baggage that the tagline comes with. In our reading, when Trump chose to use the phrase America First in 2016 and again in 2020, he was fully conscious of its implications. During Donald Trump's two most recent presidential campaigns, the slogan was once again used as both a fig leaf to cover political impropriety and a call to violent racism. As Cruz notes, by the time Trump delivered his inaugural address in January of 2017, America First had come to signal for some an isolationist politics that included abandoning long-standing military alliances and economic partnerships, stemming immigration with literal walls and free trade with figurative ones, and sounding a general retreat from the global stage. Thus, Trump campaign's deployment of the slogans offered some cover for the violence against immigrants and blacks that white supremacist Trump supporters who were champions of America First perpetuated. These champions included groups such as the KKK, America's longest-lived white supremacist organization, and the Proud Boys, a far-right neo-fascist political organization that originated in 1983's Aryan Nations World Congress. Waving the banner of America First, such groups claimed that their racialized racial violence was simply a means to rectify what they said was the marginalization of white Americans by un-American outsiders.
Trump's presidential campaigns used the phrase America First alongside Make America Great Again to signal the renewal of the American dream and to evoke an image of the citizens who will be afforded access to it. Trump used the two phrases together to convey the idea that white citizens had been marginalized by policies that favored diversity and promoted the inclusion of previously marginalized populations. Turning MAGA and America First into appeals for the restoration of decayed whiteness, he tapped into the imaginary associated with left-behind groups in the United States, or what Kathleen Stewart terms to be, quote, the other, end of quote, America, the rural, poor, white underclass found in the Deep South and Appalachia. Trump's success in convincing these voters that he could make America great again relied on two symbolic moves. First, he had to take out the post-racial claim that the United States had defeated racism against African Americans and other minority groups by electing a black president, among other things. And then, he had to take up the argument that whites had replaced minorities as the victims of discrimination and racism. Which leads us to the next point. Minorities became constructed as morally corrupt, through moral decay. To obscure the fact that in his 1916 presidential campaign was driven by ideas of white supremacy anchored in the discourses of Jim Crow-era KKK and World War II-era European fascists, Trump harnessed accusations of moral corruption leveled against him and turned them around against his opponents. On the campaign trail, Trump repeatedly made explicitly racist and otherwise bigoted remarks. These including Mexican immigrants criminals and rapists, and proposing a ban on all Muslims entering the United States. After beginning his run for office in 2015, Trump made so many derogatory comments about immigrants to the United States and minority groups in the United States that journalists started compiling lists in articles such as, quote, the 15 more offensive things ever came out of Trump's mouth, end of quote. Or, another example, here are 16 examples of Donald Trump being racist. Lowlights among the row include Trump's overall assessment of immigrants from Haiti and several African nations, quote, why are we having all these people from these shithole countries come here? We would like more people from places like Norway, end of quote. This list is long and emotionally exhausting. It points to the many ways in which Trump sees non-white people as uncivilized, as backwards, and thus unjustly privileged by immigration and by other diversity and inclusion policies that might allow them access to this so-called American dream. Trump situated the supposed corruption of minorities in a moral register. He characterized immigrants and marginalized non-white communities as dangerous jihadists, wasteful rapists, lazy procrastinators, and filthy primitives living in huts. This whole characterization of minorities as morally corrupt ties in with Trump's notion of progress. Many white Trump supporters considered Make America Great Again and America First calls for retaking America from these masses of immigrants, from blacks, women, some homosexuals, and, quotes, others, end of quote, who they believe not only endanger white male hegemony, but threaten the very idea of historical progress. This notion of historical progress, of course, relies on the racist presumption that white American men lifted the human race, quote, from some aboriginal condition of primitivism, barbarism, or even nullity, end of quote, so it could reach the apex of civilization in Trump's Great America. Unpacking this idea of progress promoted, as one sees, a move away from primitiveness towards an utopian world. And the rejection of primitiveness was crucial here. Trump's moral project was always fueled by this idea that minorities are primitive, therefore underserved, and subjects of his narrative of progress. The 2020 campaign slogan, "Keep America Great Again," drew on similar sentiments, but now from a point of arrival. So there was a shift here from making America in 2016 to keeping it great in 2020, signaling that President Trump believed that his administration had achieved such greatness in America. The year of 2020 offered him an opportunity to commemorate that achievement and to protect it from being corrupted by others he or his followers characterized as backward, morally rotten, or even, in the midst of a pandemic, racial strife, economic problems, a fundamental questioning nationwide about truth, justice, and equality.
Whereas Trump's 2016 presidential campaign veiled its white supremacist displacement of corruption onto brown and black bodies as an inside secret, the 2020 campaign brought these discourses out in the open and deployed them as outright propaganda. The executive order titled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, issued September 22, 2020, is an example of the Trump administration's consistent criminalizing of discourses of diversity, inclusion, and race and gender inequality by characterizing them as terrorist and anti-American. Another example is the 1776 Commission report, which the administration released just before the end of its term in January of 2021. Such initiatives suggest that Trump considers himself to have accomplished a return to a great America by delivering the ultimate corrective to Abraham Lincoln's vision of a nation guided by the values of liberty and equality. The initiatives appear intended to thwart any criticism of white men, positioned in the administration's official policies and pronouncements as the victims of multicultural oppression. Trump's administration, while presenting itself as morally upright and race neutral, claims that historically oppressed populations are racist towards white Americans, especially white males. The September 2020 executive order construes racism to mean discrimination against whiteness by minority groups. Thus, Trump not only denies the existence of systemic anti-black racism and other forms of discrimination against minorities in the United States, but inverts the meaning of racism to denote primarily the oppression of white men by minorities. He materialized this inversion of racism by criminalizing both the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa, an incipient and relatively disorganized anti-fascist movement that now seems to serve as a scapegoat for all right-wing criticism of leftist activism. Trump has made racism a shifting signifier that champions white supremacy. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and we look forward to any questions you might have.